Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. There is a day for all of us that will be our last. Most often, it arrives unannounced, dressed in the guise of the ordinary. It is a day of coffee, commutes, conversations, and quiet moments that are utterly mundane until they become the final punctuation mark of a life. In this series, we will walk through the final, unsuspecting hours of 4 individuals whose names became tragically famous. We will piece together the last day of the perfect victim not because they were flawless, but because on that day, they were simply living, unaware of the darkness that was about to eclipse their world forever. Case 1. The perfect victim's last day, the murder of Meredith Kercher. Perugia, a city etched into the green hills of Umbria, Italy, is a place where time feels layered. Cobblestone streets, ancient Etruscan walls, and Gothic palaces stand as monuments to a long and storied past. For students from across the globe, it is a city of learning, of culture, of awakening. In the autumn of 2007, it was home to Meredith Kercher, a 21-year-old student from the University of Leeds. She had come to Perugia for a year-long exchange program, drawn by a love for the Italian language and the promise of adventure. Meredith, or Mez, as her friends called her, was a portrait of vibrant potential. She was intelligent, poised, and possessed a quiet warmth that drew people to her. Friends described her as grounded and diligent, more focused on her studies and her close-knit circle of English friends than on the wilder aspects of student nightlife. Her laughter was a frequent sound in the cottage she shared at Via della Pergola 7, a pale yellow house perched on a slope, offering a picturesque view of the valley below. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was navigating the exhilarating and sometimes daunting world of being young and independent in a foreign country. She was, in every sense of the word, alive. November 1st, 2007 was All Saints' Day, a public holiday in Italy. The air was crisp with the scent of late autumn. For Meredith, it began like any other day of rest. She woke in her room, a space she had made her own, its window looking out onto the garden. She shared the upper level of the cottage with 2 Italian women, Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti, and 1 American student, a 20-year-old from Seattle named Amanda Knox. The Italian flatmates were away for the holiday, visiting family. The house was quieter than usual, occupied only by Meredith and Amanda. The relationship between Meredith and Amanda was polite but not deeply close. They were different people navigating a shared space. Meredith was tidy and perhaps a bit more reserved. Amanda was more bohemian and uninhibited. There had been minor frictions, as is common among roommates' disagreements over cleaning, overnight guests, and general household etiquette. But there was no indication of any profound animosity. They were simply 2 young women from different worlds, temporarily coexisting. On the morning of November 1st, Meredith spoke with her mother, Arlene, back in England. It was a normal, loving conversation. They talked about her life in Perugia, her studies, her plans. There was no hint of fear, no premonition of danger. It was the last time Arlene would ever hear her daughter's voice. Later that day, Meredith's plans were simple and pleasant. She intended to have dinner with a few of her English friends at one of their apartments. As the afternoon waned, she stayed in the cottage, perhaps studying or relaxing, a solitary figure in the quiet house. Around her, the lives of those who would soon be irrevocably linked to her fate were also unfolding in their own mundane ways. Her flatmate, Amanda Knox, had spent the previous night with her new boyfriend, a 23-year-old Italian computer engineering student named Rafael Salcido. They had begun dating only a week prior, a relationship in its intense, nascent stage. According to their later statements, their day was one of quiet domesticity at Rafael's apartment, a short walk from the cottage. They smoked hashish, watched the film Amelie, and made love. Their world, for that day, was small and self-contained, revolving around each other. Another figure, one who moved on the periphery of their social circles, was also in Perugia. His name was Rudy Guide. A 20-year-old originally from the Ivory Coast, Guide had been adopted by a wealthy Perugian family but had since become estranged from them. He was known in the city's basketball courts and among its student population. He had a history of petty crime, including a recent break-in at a nursery school where he was found by police, armed with a knife. He knew the young men who lived in the apartment below Meredith and Amanda's cottage, and by his own admission, he had a crush on Amanda. His movements on November 1st would later become the subject of intense scrutiny, a ghost in the machine of the investigation. As evening descended upon Perugia, casting long shadows across the ancient stone, Meredith prepared to leave the cottage. She dressed in comfortable clothes jeans, a light-colored sweatshirt, a jacket against the autumn chill. She walked from Via della Pergola 7 through the winding streets to her friend Sophie Purton's apartment. The dinner was a cheerful, unremarkable affair. Meredith and her friends, Sophie, Robin, and Amy, ate pizza, drank, and watched a film. They talked about their lives, their studies, the familiar topics of young women finding their way in the world. Meredith was in good spirits, laughing and engaging with her friends. She was the same Mez they had always known. There was no cloud hanging over her, no sense of impending doom. The greatest danger she seemed to face was the walk home in the dark. Around 8:45 p.m., she said her goodbyes. The walk back to her cottage was not a long one, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. It was a route she had taken many times. She walked alone, a solitary figure moving through the dimly lit, historic streets. The city was quiet. She passed through the main piazza and began the final stretch, the sloping walk up towards Via della Pergola. This was the last time anyone, besides her killer or killers, would see her alive. She was a young woman walking home. It is a scene that plays out millions of times a day, across the world. A simple act of returning to a place of supposed safety. What happened next, behind the closed doors of the cottage at Via della Pergola 7, has been the subject of two contradictory trials, immense media speculation, and a decade of debate. The only certainties are the brutal, undeniable facts found the next day. According to the narrative pieced together by prosecutors, Meredith did not arrive to an empty house. They argued that Amanda Knox had not stayed at Raphael's all night as she claimed, but had returned to the cottage with him. They contended that Rudy Gide was also present, perhaps having been invited in by Amanda, or perhaps having entered on his own. The prosecution's theory painted a picture of a confrontation that spiraled violently out of control. They suggested a bizarre, drug-fueled sex game was forced upon Meredith, a scenario she fiercely resisted. In this version of events, her refusal was met with escalating aggression. She was restrained, taunted, and ultimately murdered. The alternate timeline, and the one maintained by Amanda Knox and Raphael Salcedo, is starkly different. They insist they were at Raphael's apartment the entire night, lost in their own world, unaware of the horror unfolding just a few hundred meters away. In their version, Rudy Gide acted alone. They suggest he broke into the cottage to commit a burglary, was surprised by Meredith's return, and in a moment of panic, attacked and killed her before fleeing the scene. The physical evidence would become the battleground upon which these two realities fought for dominance. The next morning, on November 2nd, the world outside the cottage remained oblivious. Amanda Knox claims she woke up at Raphael's apartment around 10:30 a.m. and returned to the cottage alone. When she arrived, she said she noticed things that were out of place. The front door was ajar. She saw what she believed were drops of blood in the bathroom she shared with Meredith. She showered, and then she saw feces in the toilet of the other bathroom, the one used by the Italian flatmates. Most alarmingly, the door to Meredith's bedroom was locked. She returned to Raphael's apartment, confused and unsettled. She told him what she had seen. He tried to call Meredith's phone, but there was no answer. They returned to the cottage together. Raphael noticed a broken window in Filomena Romanelli's bedroom. The glass was shattered, but strangely, the shards were on top of the clothes and items on the floor, suggesting to some that the window was broken from the inside to stage a break-in. Raphael tried to force open Meredith's door, but it wouldn't budge. Growing increasingly concerned, they called the police. They also called Meredith's Italian flatmate, Filomena. Soon, the Postal Polizia branch of Italian law enforcement that deals with communications arrived at the scene. initially to investigate the discovery of two phones, Meredith's, which had been found discarded in a nearby garden. The scene at the cottage became one of growing confusion and alarm. Friends of the flatmates gathered outside. When the postal police could not open Meredith's door, a friend of the Italian roommates kicked it in. The sight that greeted them was one of unimaginable horror. Meredith Kircher was on the floor, lying under a duvet. The room was saturated in blood. The duvet was pulled up to her chest, partially obscuring the violence inflicted upon her. It was immediately clear she was dead. Her throat had been cut. The room, which just hours before had been her sanctuary, was now a sealed tomb, a brutal and silent crime scene. The investigation began immediately, and from the outset it was chaotic. The cottage was not properly secured. People traipsed in and out. Evidence was potentially contaminated before it was ever collected. The focus of the Italian investigators, the Carabinieri, quickly fell upon the two people who had discovered the scene, Amanda Knox and Rafael Salicito. Their behavior struck the investigators as strange, inappropriate. At the police station in the hours and days that followed, Amanda was seen doing cartwheels and stretches. She and Rafael were observed kissing and cuddling. To the culturally reserved Italian officers, this was not the behavior of grieving, traumatized friends. It was the behavior of cold, detached individuals with something to hide. It was the beginning of a narrative that would paint them as diabolical killers. Under intense, prolonged interrogation without legal counsel or a qualified interpreter, Amanda's story began to shift. Exhausted and psychologically pressured, she signed a statement, which she would later recant, implicating herself and a local bar owner, Patrick Lumumba, for whom she worked part-time. She claimed she had been at the cottage and had heard Meredith's screams from the kitchen while Patrick was in the bedroom with her. Lumumba had a rock-solid alibi and was quickly exonerated. But the damage was done. Amanda had placed herself at the scene of the crime in a written confession, a confession she argued was coerced. Rafael, too, gave conflicting statements. Initially, he backed up Amanda's alibi of being with him all night. But under pressure, he expressed doubts, saying he wasn't sure if she had gone out for a few hours in the middle of the night. The investigation uncovered what appeared to be damning forensic evidence. A 30-centimeter kitchen knife was found at Rafael's apartment. Prosecutors claimed it was the murder weapon. On its blade, they said they found a tiny trace of DNA belonging to Meredith. On the handle, they found DNA belonging to Amanda. This became known as the double DNA knife. Furthermore, the clasp of Meredith's bra, which had been torn off during the attack, was recovered from the crime scene floor weeks after the initial investigation. On this tiny piece of metal, analysts claimed to have found Rafael Salicito's DNA. For the prosecution, the case was clear. It was a tripartite murder, committed by Amanda, Rafael, and a third party. That third party was identified when a bloody handprint on a pillowcase at the scene was matched to Rudy Guide. Guide had fled Italy after the murder and was arrested in Germany a few weeks later. He admitted to being at the cottage that night. He claimed he had been in the bathroom when he heard Meredith scream. He said he came out to find her on the floor with a wound to her neck and saw a shadowy figure, who he claimed was not Amanda or Rafael, fleeing the scene. He admitted to trying to staunch the bleeding with towels before panicking and running away. His DNA was found all over the room and inside Meredith's body. The stage was set for one of the most sensational trials of the 21st century. The world's media descended on Perugia, transforming the case into a global spectacle. Amanda Knox, with her youthful American looks, was cast as the central character. The press dubbed her Foxy Knoxy, portraying her as a hypersexual, manipulative seductress, a she-devil hiding behind an angelic face. Rafael was cast as her willing, love-struck accomplice. Meredith Kircher, the victim, was often reduced to a footnote in the story of the accused. In 2009, after a nearly year-long trial, Amanda Knox and Rafael Salicito were found guilty of murder. Amanda was sentenced to 26 years in prison, Rafael to 25. Rudy Guide, who had opted for a separate fast-track trial, was also found guilty, his sentence eventually settling at 16 years. For the Kircher family, it was a form of justice. For the supporters of Amanda and Raphael, it was a catastrophic miscarriage of it. But the story was far from over. The defense teams launched an appeal, and this is where the prosecution's case began to crumble under forensic scrutiny. Independent experts were appointed by the appellate court to re-examine the two key pieces of evidence. They found that the alleged murder weapon, the knife from Raphael's kitchen, was not compatible with the deep wounds on Meredith's body. More importantly, they argued that the DNA trace attributed to Meredith was so minute that it was likely the result of lab contamination. The standards of the forensic lab in Rome were called into question. The collection and handling of the evidence, they concluded, was subpar. The bra clasp, the second pillar of the prosecution's case, was also discredited. The experts noted it was found on a dusty floor 46 days after the crime, in a room that had been accessed multiple times by investigators. They argued it was impossible to say with certainty that the DNA found on it had not been transferred there accidentally during the sloppy evidence collection. The risk of contamination was simply too high. Without this forensic evidence, the case against Amanda and Raphael was reduced to their strange behavior and a coerced confession. In 2011, the appeal court sensationally overturned their convictions, and they were freed after 4 years in prison. The image of a stunned Amanda Knox hearing the verdict and collapsing in tears was broadcast around the world. Yet even this was not the end. The Italian legal system allows for multiple appeals. The prosecution appealed the acquittal to Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation. In a shocking turn, the High Court annulled the acquittal in 2013, citing manifest illogicalities in the appeal court's reasoning. They ordered a brand new appeal trial to be held in Florence. Amanda remained in the United States, tried in absentia. In 2014, the court in Florence reinstated the original guilty verdicts, once again finding Amanda Knox and Raphael Salcedo responsible for the murder of Meredith Kircher. The final, definitive chapter came in 2015. Knox and Salcedo made one last appeal to the Court of Cassation. This time, the court, in its final and irrevocable judgment, exonerated them completely. The judges cited a stunning lack of biological evidence and major flaws in the investigation. They wrote of culpable omissions and amateurism. They did not just acquit them. They declared they had not committed the crime. The long legal odyssey was over. Only one person remains convicted for the murder of Meredith Kircher: Rudy Gede. He served 13 years of his 16-year sentence and was released in 2021. To this day, the official legal answer is that he did not act alone, but his accomplices have never been found. In the whirlwind of headlines, documentaries, and books, in the furious debate over the guilt or innocence of Amanda Knox, the central truth of the story can sometimes become blurred. The truth is that on November 1, 2007, a young woman named Meredith Kircher ate pizza with her friends. She laughed, she talked, she walked home under the Italian stars. She had a future filled with promise, a family that adored her, and a life that was hers to live. That life was stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable, in the one place she should have been safe. The case is not truly about Amanda Knox, or Raphael Salcedo, or even Rudy Gede. It is about Meredith. It is about the loss of a radiant life and the profound, unending grief of her family. Justice for Meredith proved to be a fractured, unsatisfying thing. While the courts delivered a final verdict for the accused, the full story of what happened in that room, the complete and unvarnished truth of her final, terrified moments, likely died with her. And so we are left to remember her not as the silent victim in a famous case, but as she was on her last day, a hopeful, vibrant young woman on the cusp of everything. Case 2. The Perfect Victim's Last Day, the Death of Kaylee Anthony. From the ancient, layered hills of Italy, our story now crosses the Atlantic to a landscape of a much newer, manufactured kind of magic. Orlando, Florida, a city built on sunshine and fantasy, the global capital of theme parks where dreams are packaged and sold. It is a place where families come to create memories, to experience a carefully curated version of happiness. But in the summer of 2008, in a quiet, manicured suburb just miles from the cheerful castles and cinematic worlds, a story would unfold that was the antithesis of this illusioned domestic nightmare of deception and death that would captivate and sicken a nation. At the heart of this story was Kaylee Marie Anthony. At 2 years old, she was on the verge of her 3rd birthday, a whirlwind of childhood energy and affection. Photos and home videos show a little girl with big, brown eyes, a joyful smile, and a personality that charmed everyone she met. She loved to swim, she loved her pets, and she adored her family, especially her mother, Casey, and her grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony, with whom she and Casey lived. In the small, beige house on Hope Spring Drive, Kaylee was the center of the universe, a bright light in what would later be revealed as a deeply fractured household. Her life, like all children's, was a collection of small, precious moments of bedtime story. A splash in the pool, a hug from her mother. She was the definition of an innocent, completely dependent on the adults around her for safety and love. Her mother, Casey Anthony, was 22. To the outside world, she presented the image of a doting single mom. But beneath the surface was a more complex and troubled young woman. For years, she had constructed a life built on a foundation of lies, both large and small. She told her parents she was working as an event planner at Universal Studios, a complete fabrication. She invented friends, created elaborate excuses for her whereabouts, and stole money from her family and friends. She was living a double life, one as a daughter and mother under her parents' roof, and another as a young, single woman immersed in the Orlando nightlife of boyfriends, parties, and freedom. Kaylee existed at the intersection of these two worlds, a responsibility that, the prosecution would later argue, Casey began to view as an obstacle to the life she truly wanted. The last day that Kaylee Anthony was seen alive by her grandparents was June 16, 2008. It began as an ordinary Monday. George Anthony left for his job as a former police officer turned security guard. He later testified that he saw Casey and Kaylee in the house as he left. His last memory of his granddaughter was of her happy and healthy, in the home where she had spent nearly her entire life. Later that day, Casey took Kaylee and left the house. She packed a bag for her daughter, took the family's white Pontiac Sunfire, and drove away from Hope Spring Drive. For Cindy and George Anthony, this was the moment their world began to quietly, irrevocably fracture. It was the last time they would ever see Kaylee alive. What followed was not the frantic search of a worried mother, but a month-long period of chilling normalcy and calculated deception on Casey's part. For 31 days, while Kaylee was missing, Casey lived the life of a young woman without a care in the world. She spent her days with her new boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro, and her nights with friends at bars and clubs. She went shopping, rented movies, and on her computer, browsed MySpace and Facebook. She was photographed at a hot body contest at a local nightclub, smiling and dancing. A few days into Kaylee's disappearance, she got a new tattoo on her left shoulder blade, the Italian phrase Bella Vita, meaning the beautiful life. All the while, her parents, Cindy and George, were growing frantic. When they would call, Casey had a ready-made, elaborate excuse for Kaylee's absence. She told them that Kaylee was with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, or Zani. This was a completely fictional character, a ghost Casey had invented to keep her parents at bay. The lies became more and more baroque. Zani was of Puerto Rican descent. They were at the beach. They were at a theme park. They were in Tampa. They were in Jacksonville. Casey claimed her job at Universal had sent her out of town, and she'd taken Kaylee and the nanny with her. Cindy and George left dozens of increasingly desperate voicemails. "Casey, it's 10 o'clock. Where are you? I'm getting pissed off," one of Cindy's messages said. "You need to call me. I'm not going to run your errands. You need to tell me where you are." But Casey would only respond with texts or brief calls, always with a new story, always with a reason why they couldn't speak to their granddaughter. She claimed the nanny had become attached to Kaylee and had, in effect, kidnapped her. But even with this fantastic claim, Casey never called the police. She told her friends a similar story, that a nanny had taken her child, Yet she showed no signs of distress. She partied, she laughed, she lived. The charade finally collapsed on July 15th. For weeks, Cindy had been trying to track down Casey's car, which had been left somewhere in Orlando. She received a letter from a tow yard. The Pontiac Sunfire had been impounded. When Cindy and George went to retrieve it, they were hit by an overpowering stench the moment the door was opened. It was a smell they both immediately recognized from George's time in law enforcement. It was, as George described it, the smell of human decomposition. The discovery of the car and its horrifying odor was the breaking point for Cindy. That evening, she finally called 911 not once but 3 times. The recordings of those calls are a raw document of a mother's and grandmother's terror and rage. In the first call, Cindy is relatively calm, trying to have her daughter arrested for stealing money and the car. But in the second, her voice is shaking with a dawning, terrible realization. "I have someone here that I need to have arrested," she tells the dispatcher, referring to Casey. "I have a possible missing child. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." The final call is the most famous and the most chilling. Cindy's control is gone, replaced by pure, panicked grief. "I'm sorry. I'm calling back because I'd like to report my granddaughter as being missing," she says, her voice cracking. "It's been a month. I was trying to get my daughter. I was trying to find her. I just found her today. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car. It smells like a dead body's been in the car. My daughter has been lying to me. Oh God." When police arrived, they were met by Casey Anthony, who was now forced to confront her lies. She calmly told the officers the story of Zani the nanny. She claimed she had dropped Kaylee off at Zani's apartment a month ago and had been searching for her ever since. She even took the police to the apartment complex where Zani supposedly lived, only for them to find the unit had been vacant for months. Then, she led them on a bizarre tour of Universal Studios, walking them through the building where she claimed to have a desk, all while knowing she had never worked a day there in her life. By the end of the night, the investigators knew they were not dealing with a typical distraught mother. They were dealing with a pathological liar. Casey Anthony was arrested. The investigation now bifurcated into 2 parts: the search for a missing little girl and the forensic examination of the evidence she had left behind. The search for Kaylee became a national obsession. Volunteers from across the country descended on Orlando, combing through swamps, forests, and trash heaps, all holding on to the desperate hope of finding her alive. The media dubbed her the nation's daughter. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were meticulously taking apart the Pontiac Sunfire. The smell of death was the most potent piece of evidence. Cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of human remains in the trunk. Air sample analysis from the trunk revealed the presence of chloroform, a chemical that can be used to render someone unconscious, as well as other compounds consistent with decomposition. A single strand of hair found in the trunk showed microscopic signs of root banding, a characteristic seen in hairs from a decomposing body. A faint stain on the trunk's carpet liner was also identified, though it couldn't be definitively matched to Kaylee. Investigators also seized the Anthony family's home computer. What they found was damning. In the weeks before Kaylee disappeared, someone had used the computer to perform Google searches. On March 17, 2008, a search for chloroform. On March 21st, searches for how to make chloroform, neck breaking, and how to make weapons out of household products. Then, on June 16th, the very day Kaylee was last seen by her grandparents, a search at 2:51 p.m. for foolproof suffocation. Casey's defense would later argue that George had made these searches, looking up information on suicide after a fight with Cindy, but the timing was deeply suspicious. For 5 months, the search for Kaylee continued with no results. The hope that had fueled the volunteers began to fade, replaced by a grim resignation. Then, on December 11, 2008, a discovery was made that brought the search to its horrific conclusion. A meter reader named Roy Kronk, walking through a wooded, swampy area less than a quarter-mile from the Anthony home, noticed a white plastic bag on the ground. He nudged it with a stick and a small human skull rolled out. Police sealed off the area. In the coming days, they would find the scattered skeletal remains of a small child. With the bones were the remnants of a Winnie the Pooh blanket, one known to belong to Kaylee. Most chillingly, duct tape was found matted in the hair and affixed to the area where the mandible or lower jaw would have been. The medical examiner could not determine an exact cause of death due to the advanced state of decomposition, but ruled it a homicide by undetermined means. The duct tape, however, strongly suggested suffocation. The remains were positively identified through DNA as those of Caylee Anthony. The trial of Casey Anthony began in May 2011. It was a media circus broadcast live and watched by millions. The prosecution, led by Jeff Ashton and Linda Drain-Burdick, laid out a clear and simple theory. Casey Anthony, they argued, saw her daughter as a burden. She wanted to live the bella vita, a life of parties and boyfriends, unencumbered by the responsibilities of motherhood. So, on June 16th, she used chloroform to knock Caylee out, then placed duct tape over her nose and mouth, suffocating her. She hid the body in the trunk of her car for several days before dumping it in the woods near her home. The evidence was her pattern of lies, the forensic findings in the car, the computer searches, and the duct tape found on her daughter's skull. The defense, led by a charismatic but then unknown attorney named Jose Baez, responded with a bombshell that no one saw coming. In his opening statement, Baez presented a completely different narrative. Caylee's death, he claimed, was not a murder but a tragic accident. On June 16th, she had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool. Her grandfather, George Anthony, was the one who found her body. According to Baez, George, a former cop, panicked. Instead of calling 911, he decided to cover up the death to protect Casey. He instructed Casey to go out and act as if nothing was wrong. Baez argued that Casey's 31 days of lying and partying were not the actions of a cold-blooded killer, but of a traumatized young woman following her father's orders. To explain why Casey would participate in such a grotesque cover-up and why she was such a chronic liar, Baez deployed his most shocking and controversial tactic. He claimed that Casey had been sexually abused by her father, George, since she was a child. This history of abuse, he argued, created a deeply dysfunctional family dynamic and taught Casey to lie and compartmentalize trauma. George Anthony vehemently denied the allegations on the stand. There was no physical evidence to support them. It was a high-risk strategy that aimed to destroy the credibility of the state's key witness and paint Casey as a victim in her own right. For 6 weeks, the jury listened to testimony from forensic experts, family members, friends, and law enforcement. The prosecution's forensic case, which seemed so strong, began to show cracks under cross-examination. The air sample evidence for chloroform was new and its reliability was questioned. The amount was so small it could have been a contaminant. The DNA evidence was not a perfect match. Baez managed to create doubt around every piece of physical evidence. What the state was left with was Casey's undeniable mountain of lies. The case became a question of character. Was she a liar because she was a murderer, or was she just a liar? The jury was tasked with answering that question. After less than 11 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict that stunned the world. On July 5, 2011, Casey Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, and not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child. She was found guilty only of 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The nation reacted with collective disbelief and outrage. The woman who had partied while her daughter's body decomposed, the woman who had lied for 31 days, was, for all intents and purposes, walking free. In the end, the story of Caylee Anthony is one of profound and unsettling ambiguity. The jury, bound by the high standard of reasonable doubt, did not feel the prosecution had proven its case. They were not saying Casey was innocent. They were saying the state had failed to prove she was guilty. And so, the central question remains unanswered by the legal system. How did Caylee Anthony die? Was it a cold, calculated murder by a mother who wanted her freedom? Or was it a tragic accident, covered up by a family so broken that its first instinct was to hide the truth rather than seek help? We are left only with the certainty of the loss. A 2-year-old girl vanished from the world. Her last day was not one of celebration or special occasion. It was an ordinary day that ended in an extraordinary tragedy. A day that was then deliberately and systematically erased by the person who should have protected her most fiercely. The beautiful life that Casey Anthony sought was built upon the silence of her daughter. And while the courts have closed their books on the case, for Kaylee, there is no justice, only the heartbreaking memory of a life unlived. A story without a final, truthful chapter. Case 3. The perfect victim's last day. The unsolved murder of an angel. We leave the humid, deceptive sunshine of modern Florida and travel back in time, to a place and an era that has become a symbol of American innocence. The year is 1957. The town is Sycamore, Illinois, a small community nestled in the heart of the Midwest. This was the America of Norman Rockwell paintings, a world of unlocked doors, close-knit neighborhoods, and the prevailing belief that children were safe playing in their own front yards. It was a time of burgeoning post-war prosperity and unwavering optimism. The monsters, it was thought, lived in faraway lands or on movie screens, not on the quiet, tree-lined streets of a town like Sycamore. This collective sense of security was an invisible shield, one that was about to be shattered with a single, inexplicable act of darkness. In this idyllic world lived Maria Ridolph. She was 7 years old, a little girl with a doll-like face, bright eyes, and a sweet, trusting nature. To her family and neighbors, she was a whisper of a girl, a small, cherished presence who embodied the town's gentle spirit. She lived with her parents, Michael and Francis, and her older siblings, in a modest home where life followed a predictable and comforting rhythm. Her best friend in the entire world was 8-year-old Kathy Sigmund, who lived just down the block. Their friendship was the kind unique to childhood, an inseparable bond forged in games of tag, whispered secrets, and shared adventures on their quiet corner of Archie Moore and Center Cross Street. December 3, 1957, began as a day of crisp winter promise. A light snow had fallen, dusting Sycamore in a blanket of white. As the afternoon sun began its low arc towards the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, Maria and Kathy were playing outside. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated childhood. They were playing a game they called Duck the Cars, running in circles around a large maple tree that stood as a silent guardian on the parkway between their homes. The air was cold, their breath pluming in front of them, their laughter echoing in the quiet twilight. It was then that a stranger appeared. A young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s, walked up to them. He was not overtly menacing. His voice was friendly. He introduced himself as Johnny. In the trusting world of 1957 Sycamore, this was not an immediate cause for alarm. He offered them piggyback rides. Maria, ever the more trusting of the two, accepted. The young man hoisted her onto his back and trotted around the yard, both of them laughing. For a few moments, the three of them, two small girls and a man who called himself Johnny, existed in this strange but seemingly harmless tableau. But the winter air was biting. Kathy, feeling the cold seep into her hands, told the others she was going inside to get her mittens. It was a simple, childish errand, a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She ran into her house, a journey that took only a few minutes. She fumbled for her mittens, perhaps exchanged a quick word with her mother, and then ran back outside, eager to rejoin the game. When she returned to the corner, the world had changed. The laughter was gone. The yard was silent. The only thing left was an unnerving stillness. Johnny and Maria had vanished. Kathy stood there for a moment, confused. She called out Maria's name. There was no answer. She looked up and down the street. Nothing. She ran to Maria's house and knocked on the door. Maria's older brother, Charles, answered. "Is Maria home?" Kathy asked. He said no. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of Kathy's confusion. She told Charles what had happened, about the man named Johnny, about the piggyback ride, about her mittens. The alarm spread like a fire. Frances Ridolph, Maria's mother, was called. The police were notified. Within the hour, The quiet corner of Archie Moore and Center Cross Street was transformed. The single flashing light of a police car became a beacon, drawing neighbors from their homes, their faces etched with concern. The shield of Sycamore's innocence had been pierced. A child had been stolen from her own front yard in the fading moments of daylight. The search for Maria Ridolph was immediate and immense. It was as if the town itself was trying to physically expel the darkness that had invaded it. Hundreds of volunteers, then thousands, fanned out across the frozen fields and woods surrounding Sycamore. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting futilely through the black, winter night. They called her name until their voices were raw. The story quickly became national news. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was kept updated. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI joined the investigation. The face of the small, smiling girl was suddenly everywhere in newspapers, on television screens, a haunting symbol of a nation's stolen sense of safety. The investigation had a prime suspect almost immediately. Kathy Sigmund provided a description of Johnny, a tall, slender young man with light-colored hair. The description matched a local teenager, an 18-year-old named John Tessier. Tessier lived just a few blocks away, was known in the neighborhood, and had a reputation for being a bit of a troublemaker. He was brought in for questioning, but Tessier had what appeared to be an ironclad alibi. On the day Maria disappeared, he told investigators he had traveled 40 miles away to Rockford, Illinois. He was there for a pre-induction physical and to enlist in the U.S. Air Force. He claimed he was in Rockford at the time of the abduction. To prove it, he pointed to a collect phone call he had made from the Rockford post office to his parents' home in Sycamore at 6:57 p.m. The FBI and local police thoroughly investigated this alibi. They confirmed his presence in Rockford. They confirmed the recruiting appointment. They confirmed the phone call. John Tessier was cleared. He was just another neighborhood kid who happened to fit a vague description. He soon left for the Air Force and the investigation moved on. The search continued for months. The winter snows melted, revealing a landscape barren of clues. The Ridolph family lived in a state of suspended agony, clinging to a hope that dwindled with each passing day. The town held its breath, waiting for a resolution that never came. Then, on April 26, 1958, nearly 5 months after she disappeared, the waiting ended in the most devastating way possible. A man searching for mushrooms in a dense, wooded area near Woodbine, Illinois, about 100 miles from Sycamore, stumbled upon the decomposing remains of a small child, hidden under a tree. Dental records confirmed the unthinkable. It was Maria Ridolph. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, a definitive cause of death was difficult to establish, but the evidence suggested she had been asphyxiated or stabbed. The discovery brought a new, profound wave of grief to Sycamore. The town that had searched with such desperate hope now mourned with bottomless sorrow. Maria Ridolph was laid to rest, but her case remained open. Johnny was a ghost, a faceless phantom who had materialized on a snowy evening and dissolved back into the ether, leaving behind a wound that would never fully heal. The case grew cold, filed away under the heading of unsolved. Decades passed. Sycamore grew and changed. Children who had lived in fear in 1957 grew up and had children of their own. The America of the 1950s became a distant sepia-tone memory. But the story of Maria Ridolph never truly went away. It became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next. Then, in 2008, more than 50 years after Maria's disappearance, the cold case suddenly thawed. The catalyst was a deathbed confession. John Tessier's half-sister, Janet, came forward with a shocking story. She said that on her deathbed, their mother, Eileen, had unburdened herself of a terrible secret she had carried for half a century. Eileen claimed that her son, John, had been responsible for Maria's death. She spoke of his return home on the night of December 3, 1957, of his agitation, of a mother's intuition that something was terribly wrong. She confessed that she had lied to the police to protect him. "It was Johnny," she had whispered. "He did it." This dramatic revelation was enough to prompt Illinois State Police to reopen the investigation. They looked at the old files with fresh eyes. The world of forensics and investigative techniques had changed dramatically in 50 years. They began to question the ironclad alibi that had cleared John Tessier so long ago. Was the timeline truly impossible? Could he have committed the crime and still made it to Rockford for that 6:57 p.m. phone call? Investigators tracked down the key witness, Kathy Sigmund, now a woman in her late 50s, living under a new married name. They presented her with a photo Lanupa collection of pictures of young men from that era. One of them was a photograph of John Tessier at age 18. After staring at the images, after dredging up a memory buried for 5 decades, she pointed to one face. It was John Tessier. "That's the man," she said, her voice filled with a lifetime of held-back certainty. The investigation zeroed in on the man who now called himself Jack McCullough. After his time in the Air Force, he had moved to Washington State, married, had children, and was living a quiet life in Seattle, working as a security guard at a retirement community. He was a 71-year-old man, far removed from the 18-year-old kid from Sycamore. In July 2011, Jack McCullough was arrested and charged with the 1957 murder of Maria Ridolph. The news was stunning. It was proclaimed to be the oldest cold case in American history to result in an arrest. For the surviving members of the Ridolph family and the community of Sycamore, it felt like a miracle, a ghost from the past finally being brought to justice. The trial, held in 2012, was a spectacle of time travel. Elderly witnesses took the stand to recall events from more than half a century earlier. The prosecution, led by the DeKalb County State's Attorney, presented a compelling narrative. They argued that Eileen Tessier's deathbed confession and Kathy Sigmund's eyewitness identification were the keys that unlocked the truth. They systematically dismantled McCullough's old alibi, arguing that the phone call could have been faked or that the timeline was, in fact, plausible. They painted McCullough as a monster who had hidden in plain sight for decades. McCullough, for his part, maintained his innocence, looking on with a kind of weary disbelief. In September 2012, a judge found Jack McCullough guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. It seemed the story had finally reached its conclusion. Justice, delayed for 55 years, had finally been served. The book on the murder of Maria Ridolph was closed. But the story was not over. In 2015, a new state's attorney, Richard Schmack, was elected in DeKalb County. As part of his duties, he began to review old cases, including the high-profile conviction of Jack McCullough. What he found did not just trouble him, it horrified him. He believed the conviction was a profound miscarriage of justice. Schmack conducted his own exhaustive 6-month review of the entire case file, going back to the original 1957 documents. He discovered that the prosecution in the 2012 trial had suppressed or ignored crucial evidence that pointed to McCullough's innocence. He found the original, newly unearthed phone records from the telephone company in 1957. They proved, unequivocally, that a collect call was placed from Rockford by John Tessier at 6:57 p.m., a time when multiple witnesses had established Maria was still alive and playing outside in Sycamore. The abduction, according to the original 1957 timeline, happened closer to 7 p.m. It was physically impossible for him to have been in both places. Furthermore, Schmack determined that the photo lineup shown to Kathy Sigmund was deeply flawed and suggestive. She had been shown only one picture of Tessier, a high-quality military ID photo, while the other photos were grainy and of poor quality, making his face stand out. Her memory, however sincere, had likely been contaminated by suggestion after 50 years. Eileen Tessier's deathbed confession was unreliable, second-hand hearsay from a family with a long and troubled history. The original 1957 FBI files, which Schmack reviewed, had concluded Tessier's alibi was airtight. In an extraordinary legal move, the prosecutor who was supposed to defend the conviction now sought to overturn it. In April 2016, Richard Schmack went before a judge and declared that Jack McCullough was innocent. The judge agreed, threw out the conviction, and ordered McCullough's immediate release from prison. After serving nearly 4 years for a crime he did not commit, the 76-year-old man walked free. The court later issued him a certificate of innocence, officially clearing his name. The case of Maria Ridolf is not simply unsolved. It is twice unsolved. The brief, fleeting sense of closure that the 2012 conviction provided was revealed to be a mirage, an illusion of justice built on flawed memories and a rush to judgment. The pursuit of an answer, any answer, had created a new victim. We are left where the town of Sycamore was left in the spring of 1958, with a profound and painful mystery. The real killer, the friendly young man who called himself Johnny, remains a phantom. He stepped out of the twilight on a snowy December evening, stole the life of a 7-year-old girl, and shattered the innocence of a town forever. He was never caught. His identity, his motives, his story, all are lost to time. All that remains is the memory of Maria, the little angel of Sycamore, whose last day on earth ended in a question that, after all these years, still has no answer. Case 4. The Perfect Victim's Last Day, the Killing of Johnny Versace. Our final story takes us from the quiet, snow-covered streets of a mid-century town to the sun-drenched, neon-lit opulence of 1990s Miami Beach. This is a world not of hidden, small-town secrets, but of extravagant, public spectacle. It is a world of beauty, fame, and immense wealth, where life itself is a form of performance art. And at its absolute epicenter, its reigning monarch, was a man who did not just create fashion, but who defined an entire era of audacious glamour: Gianni Versace. Versace was more than a designer. He was a cultural force. Born in Reggio Calabria, Italy, he had built a global empire from thread and vision. His work was a vibrant, unapologetic celebration of life: bold colors, daring cuts, and a fusion of classical art with raw sexuality. He draped the world's most famous bodies in his creations, from Princess Diana to Madonna, from Elton John to the supermodels who became legends under his patronage. He was the architect of 90s excess, a man whose genius was matched only by his zest for living. His home, the Casa Casuarina, was a physical manifestation of his soul. Located on Ocean Drive in the heart of South Beach, the sprawling mansion was a monument to Baroque magnificence. With its Medusa-head logo emblazoned on the gates, its lavish mosaics, frescoed ceilings, and a 54-foot-long swimming pool lined with 24-karat gold, it was not merely a house but a palace. It was a private sanctuary from which he ruled a public kingdom of style. Here, surrounded by his art, his family, and his long-term partner, Antonio D'Amico, Gianni Versace lived a life that was, by any measure, extraordinary. He was 50 years old, at the peak of his creative powers, a creator of beauty basking in the world he had built. But as Versace was curating this world of light and luxury, another man was moving through the shadows of a very different America. His journey was a twisted pilgrimage not toward creation, but toward destruction. His name was Andrew Cunanan. Andrew Cunanan, 27 years old, was Versace's dark mirror image. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed a photogenic smile. But his life was an elaborate fiction, a house of cards built on pathological lies. Raised in a middle-class family in California, he was doted upon by his father, who filled his head with delusions of grandeur. When his father, a stockbroker, was exposed as an embezzler and fled the country, Andrew's world collapsed. From then on, he dedicated himself to living a fantasy. He became a social chameleon, a hanger-on in the wealthy gay communities of San Diego and San Francisco. He told people he came from a wealthy family, that he was an architect, a naval officer, an antiquities dealer. He lived off the generosity of older, wealthier men, weaving intricate webs of deceit to maintain an illusion of status he desperately craved. But by the spring of 1997, the fantasy was unraveling. He was aging out of his role as a young protégé. His benefactors were cutting him off. The lies were becoming harder to sustain. He was facing the terrifying prospect of a normal life, a life of work and anonymity, a life he considered a death sentence. And so, a dark resentment that had been festering for years finally erupted into a murderous rage. In late April 1997, Andrew Cunanan began a cross-country killing spree that would carve a path of terror toward Miami Beach. The first victim was Jeffrey Trail. A former naval officer and a friend of Cunanan's, Trail had moved to Minneapolis, seemingly to distance himself from Andrew's increasingly erratic behavior. Cunanan, feeling rejected, followed him there. On April 27th, he lured Trail to the apartment of David Madsen, Cunanan's former lover. There, in an act of brutal, personal violence, he beat Jeffrey Trail to death with a claw hammer, rolled his body in a rug, and left it in the apartment. The second victim was David Madsen himself. For 5 days, Madsen, a successful architect, was Cunanan's hostage. They drove together through the Minnesota countryside in Madsen's red Jeep Cherokee. What happened during those 5 days is a mystery. Were they on the run together, or was Madsen a terrified captive? The journey ended on the shore of a remote lake. Cunanan shot David Madsen in the back and head, leaving his body near the water's edge. He had now murdered the 2 men who represented his past life in the Midwest. From there, Cunanan drove the stolen Jeep to Chicago. His target was Lee Miglin, a 72-year-old real estate magnate, a man of immense wealth and social standing. On May 4th, Cunanan entered Miglin's opulent home in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The crime scene was one of sadistic, prolonged torture. Miglin was bound with duct tape, his head wrapped like a mummy. He was stabbed with a screwdriver, his ribs were broken, and his throat was cut with a hacksaw. Cunanan spent 2 days in the house, eating, sleeping, and helping himself to cash and valuables before stealing Miglin's Lexus and driving. Andrew Cunanan was now one of the most wanted men in America. The FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. His face was on the news every night, but he continued his journey east. On May 9th, in Pennsville, New Jersey, he needed a new vehicle. He found his 4th victim at a quiet, historic cemetery. William Reese, a 45-year-old caretaker, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Cunanan shot him in the head, stole his red Chevrolet pickup truck, and left the stolen Lexus behind. He had murdered an innocent man for his truck. This was the act of a man with nothing left to lose, a man completely detached from human empathy. With the stolen red pickup, Cunanan turned south. His destination was Miami Beach. He arrived on May 12, 1997. For the next 2 months, the most wanted man in America hid in plain sight. He checked into the Normandy Plaza Hotel, a cheap, run-down establishment a few miles north of the glamorous heart of South Beach. He used his own name. He pawned a gold coin he had stolen from Lee Miglin, again using his own name and leaving a thumbprint on the receipt. He was seen at clubs and restaurants. He seemed to be taunting law enforcement, living with a bizarre mixture of arrogance and desperation. He was a predator patiently stalking his final prey. He was waiting for Johnny Versace. The morning of July 15, 1997, began for Johnny Versace with a simple, cherished routine. Around 8:30 a.m., he walked out of the grand gates of the Casa Casuarina. He wore a dark t-shirt, light shorts, and sandals. He was alone. He strolled the 4 blocks down Ocean Drive to the News Cafe, a bustling spot where he was a regular. He bought a coffee and a stack of 5 magazines, including Vogue and Entertainment Weekly. He paid with a $20 bill, smiled at the staff, and began his leisurely walk back home. The walk was a portrait of a man at peace in his world. The sun was warm, the ocean breeze was gentle. He was surrounded by the vibrant energy of the city he had helped put on the map. He was just a man buying his morning papers, an act of mundane normalcy that grounded his extraordinary life. He reached the gates of his mansion, unlocked them, and began to ascend the few stone steps that led into his private paradise. It was at that exact moment that Andrew Cunanan, who had been waiting, made his move. He approached Versace from behind, quickly and deliberately. He raised a .40 caliber pistol and fired 2 shots. Both struck Johnny Versace in the back of the head, execution style. The sound of the gunshots cracked through the morning air, a violent intrusion into the rhythm of Ocean Drive. Versace collapsed onto the cold stone steps, the magazines scattering around him, their glossy pages instantly stained with his blood. Antonio D'Amico, inside the mansion, heard the shots. He ran outside to a scene of surreal horror. He saw Johnny, his partner of 15 years, lying in a pool of blood on the steps of their home. His screams of agony alerted the staff and the few passers-by. The creator of so much beauty, a man whose entire life was a testament to vibrancy and color, lay dead in an instant of brutal, ugly violence. Andrew Cunanan, his mission complete, calmly walked away, disappearing into the side streets of South Beach. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Police swarmed the scene. The news exploded across the globe. A god of fashion had been assassinated on the steps of his own palace. The manhunt for Andrew Cunanan, which had been a national story, now became a global obsession. The key piece of evidence was found just 2 blocks away, the red pickup truck that had belonged to William Reese. Inside, police found Cunanan's clothes, a passport, and clippings about his other murders. There was no doubt who the killer was. The entire city of Miami and much of South Florida went on lockdown. Every police officer, every FBI agent in the region, was now singularly focused on finding one man. For 8 days, Cunanan remained a ghost. He was the most famous fugitive on the planet, yet he had vanished. The end came on July 23rd, just over a week after the murder. The discovery was almost accidental. A caretaker for a luxury houseboat moored in a nearby marina noticed that someone seemed to be squatting on the vessel. When he went to investigate, a shot was fired in his direction. He called the police. A massive SWAT team descended on the marina, surrounding the 2-story houseboat. For hours, they tried to make contact, firing tear gas into the boat. There was no response. Finally, as evening fell, a tactical team stormed the boat. They found Andrew Cunanan in an upstairs bedroom. He was dead. He had placed the same .40 caliber pistol that had killed Versace, Madsen, and Reese into his own mouth and pulled the trigger. He was wearing only a pair of boxer shorts. The most extensive manhunt in recent memory had ended not with a dramatic capture, but with the quiet, lonely suicide of a desperate man. With his death, Andrew Cunanan took the one thing the world wanted most: the answer to the question, why? Why Gianni Versace? The motive remains one of true crime's great, unsolved mysteries. Cunanan's friends and acquaintances claimed he was obsessed with Versace. He often boasted that he knew the famous designer, that they had met in San Francisco in 1990. Some witnesses have supported this claim, recalling a brief, casual encounter at a nightclub. But the Versace family has always adamantly denied that any relationship, even a fleeting one, existed. Was the murder a crime of personal passion, the spurned advance of a delusional fantasist? Or was it something more symbolic, more chilling? The most widely accepted theory is that the killing was the ultimate act of narcissistic rage. Cunanan's life of lies had been built in the shadow of men like Versace. He craved the fame, the acceptance, the wealth, and the adoration that Versace commanded so effortlessly. When his own fantasy world crumbled, he sought to destroy the ultimate symbol of the world that had, in his mind, rejected him. By killing Gianni Versace, Andrew Cunanan ensured that his name would be forever linked with the man he could never be. He could not create, so he destroyed. He could not be famous for his life, so he would become infamous for his crimes. He achieved a permanent, parasitic connection to greatness. The legacy of that sunny July morning is one of profound, senseless loss. Gianni Versace was a true original, a visionary whose art brought joy and beauty to the world. He was a man in love with life, stolen from it by a man who had nothing but contempt for it. His last day began with a simple walk to buy magazines, a quiet moment of routine before returning to a life of vibrant creation. It ended on his doorstep, a final, brutal collision between a man who built a world and a man who sought only to burn it down. We have walked through the final, unsuspecting hours of 4 lives. A bright student in a historic Italian town, a trusting child in the manufactured sunshine of Florida, a little girl on a snowy Midwestern street, and a titan of fashion in his seaside palace. Their stories are vastly different, yet they are bound by a common, tragic thread. They all began their last day as an ordinary one, filled with the simple acts of living a phone call home, a game with a friend, a walk to a cafe. They were unaware that they were walking toward a darkness that would not only end their lives but would transform their names into bywords for tragedy. These stories serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of the mundane, of the thin veil that separates a normal day from a final one. In remembering them, we do more than recount the details of a crime. We honor a life. We remember not just the victim, but the person. We remember Meredith, Kaylee, Maria, and Johnny, not for how they died, but for the light they brought to the world on all the days before their last. Thank you for listening. Sleep well and stay safe.